Good evening, everyone. My name is Jim Turk, and I'm the director of the Center for Free Expression, and I want to welcome you to tonight's discussion. I want to begin by acknowledging that the land on which I am welcoming you tonight is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. It is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. I also want to acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaty, signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. Tonight, we're having the 8th from the Center for Free Expression's weekly virtual forum series, a conversation with Sheldon Levy, whom I will properly introduce in a moment, about challenges facing smart cities projects in Canada and beyond. We're going to explore what happened with Google affiliate Sidewalk Labs proposals for a smart city community on Toronto's waterfront, which sparked both utopian dreams and dystopian fears. Although Sidewalk Labs has walked away, all of the issues regarding technology-centered urban development remain. We're going to explore these issues and explore what lessons might be learned for Toronto, for cities across Canada considering smart cities initiatives, and elsewhere. After a while, we'll bring you, the audience, into the conversation. If you'd like to ask a question of Sheldon, please go scroll down or move your cursor down to the bottom of the center of your screen, and you'll see a Q&A button. You simply click on that and you can write a question at any point from the beginning of it. So when a question comes to mind, just enter it there and it will go to the center's coordinator, Ange Holmes. And so when I turn to the audience for questions, I'll turn to Ange and ask her to share the first question that's come in. So please feel free at any time during the event to write questions under the Q&A button. Next to it, there's a chat button, which does not function. So it's disabled. So just use the Q&A button. The whole conversation, as well as the question and answer period, is being recorded. And a video recording of that will be posted on the Center for Free Expression website tomorrow. You can look at our website under the events page. And the CFE website is CFE, for Center for Free Expression, cfe.ryerson.ca. Before going forward, I want to express appreciation to Ange Holmes, our coordinator, who really does most of the work to make these virtual panel discussions possible. And I'm very grateful for the wonderful work she does. And we're also grateful to Brian Bowes and Luke Nader, who are from Ryerson University's Media Services Department. Their technical expertise has been and continues to be invaluable. The final panel in our June series is going to be next Tuesday at 2 p.m. in Eastern Daylight Time. So next Tuesday, a week from today, at June 30th at 2 p.m. It will focus on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and other digital platforms, looking at the many serious challenges they cause, and whether and how these might be able to be fixed. The panel is being co-sponsored by PEN Canada, and there's more information about the panel, again, on our website, cfe.ryerson.ca, under the heading of events. And now, our guest for tonight, Sheldon Levy. Sheldon is best known for what has been properly described as his decade-long visionary leadership as president of Ryerson University from 2005 to 2015. He played a decisive role in Ryerson's transformation into one of the major universities in Canada. Before Ryerson, Sheldon served as president of Oakville's Sheraton College from 1997 to 2001, overseeing the growth of its renowned animation department during the early years of computer-generated imaging. Then he served as Vice President, Finance and Strategy for the University of Ontario Institute of Technology, followed by serving as Vice President of Governmental and Institutional Relations at the University of Toronto, and then Vice President, Institutional Affairs at York University. After retiring from Ryerson, he actually hasn't retired, Sheldon served 2 years as Ontario's Deputy Minister of Advanced Education and Skills Development. In 2017, he became the CEO of Next Canada, and subsequently was appointed Special Advisor to Canada's Minister of Small Business and Export Promotion, Mary Ng, on the issue of scaling up small and medium-sized businesses. I think it's fair to say that a distinguishing feature of Sheldon's presidency of Ryerson was seeing his role as a city builder, which amongst other things brought him into being a member of the board of Waterfront Toronto and familiarity with the issues leading to the Quayside Smart Cities project that we're going to be talking about tonight. While he left the board before that project got fully underway, his involvement and engagement led to him being an appointed independent member of Waterfront Toronto's evaluation committee for Quayside, which reported this past January on whether Waterfront Toronto was prepared for negotiations with Sidewalk Labs and its parent Alphabet, whether Waterfront Toronto fully understood the issues and their importance, and his covering letter on behalf of the committee affirmed that Waterfront Toronto overcame both these hurdles. So Sheldon, I do welcome you to be with us in the audience tonight. And I'd like to start perhaps asking you, you were on the board of Waterfront Toronto during much of your presidency of Ryerson. Could you give us a little background, the audience a little background on what Waterfront Toronto is? And then perhaps could you help us understand where the initiative came from to use part of the port lands for a smart cities project? So let's just start with, if you could tell people what Waterfront Toronto is and how it came into being.
Well, first of all, Jim, thank you for inviting me to be part of this, and it's always good to see you. And for those in the audience, it's feel welcome here. I think the story probably goes back into the 80s, if not before. And the story was that as Toronto grew, the distance that the citizens of Toronto felt from the waterfront seemed to increase. They would see large condos being built that would essentially remove them from the waterfront. And we looked at other cities like Chicago and asked ourselves questions, why can't our waterfront be better than what it is today? And that goes back into the 90s. So in 1999, there was a task force that was begun that was on the revitalization of the Toronto waterfront. And in that task force, there was a number of objectives that were set, and they were included that the edge or the waterfront itself should be more accessible. There were questions with regard to the Gardiner. Should it remain? Should it be torn down? There are questions of sustainability, new neighborhoods, affordable homes, more parks, and the list was long. But in that list, they said that you had to have a group that took charge of all these issues. You couldn't leave it as a hodgepodge of individual decisions. And in 2001, that group became Waterfront Toronto. And it was a group that had the support not only of the City of Toronto, but the federal and provincial government. So much of their mandate of Waterfront Toronto was actually set in 1999. Now, a lot of the words of innovation certainly have changed from 1999 to 2019, but the spirit of what was wanted to be achieved right back from 1999 continued to drive Waterfront Toronto. So one aspect of it, Jim, was that back in 1999, this task force described innovation, but they never used the word. They sort of described it as coming together of different attributes of culture, technology, but it was really innovation. So Waterfront Toronto had a natural inclination to move into the area of the innovation, and that led to the RFP that led to Sidewalk Labs. But there is a long story between 1999 and 2020.
So were there any key developments or whatever that inclined Waterfront Toronto to really put together an RFP for a smart cities project? I mean, was that inspired by the Chamber of Commerce, by City Council, by residents groups? So where did that come from?
Yeah, so this is my interpretation of events, because a lot of it, people will have different views on it. So I would say this is my view of the history of it.
Okay, fair enough.
So early on, when Waterfront Toronto began its work, it did some really, really splendid work. And a lot of it goes unnoticed, like the work that it did on reclaiming lands and on improving the ability for the city to handle flooding, a variety of what you could call infrastructure things.
Well, I mean, there were serious environmental problems, weren't there, and flooding issues and contamination issues on the waterfront?
And the ability to build on the waterfront itself required a huge amount of investment in the infrastructure. And that was work that was supported by all levels of government, and really, really good work. And sometimes we don't applaud the good work with sewers, if I could call it that way, because we don't see the flood, but boy, oh boy, we're glad it doesn't happen. So a lot of what you could call this good infrastructure work was started. But and if you go back, I did this in advance. If you go back into looking at the articles written on what Waterfront Toronto was doing, and there was a lot of, hey, this is actually moving for the first time. There seems to be a consistency. It's looking good. And by and large, it was, people were beginning to see progress. And the only way, you see progress is to remember what it was like. And now look what it is. But I also think, Jim, what happened was that as things were getting improving, there was a wish, if I could put it that way, that the revitalization report with regard to we could be better than just infrastructure, we could be better than just nice parks, we could be something really, really wonderful. And the word innovation started to surface more in everyone's minds. And I think what was going on was that in the early days of Waterfront Toronto, I use the expression, when you build 90-degree angles, everyone understands 90-degree angles. And by and large, Waterfront Toronto would be able to bring its communities along because things were going okay. But there was always this wish that we could do better. And so when the better started as a bit of dreaming and more on the innovation side, this was the beginning of the RFP to what was then Quayside, which is Quayside, and the lands that sort of had a bigger dream of what was possible. And that dream started to move from those things that people were, I'd say, relatively easy to understand, to things that were more controversial. And the RFP itself entered into a new realm that eventually brought Sidewalk Labs here. But it was an evolution from 2001 all the way to today.
So the Waterfront Board is made up, as I understand it, of appointees from the federal government, the provincial government, and the city government. Is that correct?
Right.
And the land, just for the audience, the lands that it deals with run, what, are there a couple hundred acres of land along the waterfront roughly?
Yeah, it's a very large area of land, but the project that Sidewalk Labs was one aspect of that lands, but there's a lot of work that they've done all the way from right across the front of the city of Toronto.
So I mean, it would go from, so the lands that Sidewalk Labs project was focused on, at least initially, called Quayside, is about a 12-acre parcel, sort of at the foot of Parliament Street.
That's right,
For
right at
people,
the foot
for
of
people in
Parliament.
for people in the audience who know Toronto. But the port lands that Waterfront Toronto dealt with would stretch all the way to the west end of the city, would they not? Or a long way toward the
Yes,
west end?
yes. But remember although it was a Quayside project, the ambition and the presentation of Sidewalk Labs was over a much larger piece of land than just Quayside.
Yeah, we're going to get to that. So originally, the request for proposals, the RFP, focused on this 12-acre plot just at the foot of,
That's right.
and then Sidewalk Labs, not surprising for a Google affiliated company, had a bigger vision of what it might like to do.
Yeah.
For members of our audience who don't know much about Sidewalk Labs itself, could you tell us a bit about what it is and what led to its involvement with Waterfront Toronto as the pivotal partner for the Quayside Smart Cities project?
Yeah, so at the time the RFP was issued by Toronto Waterfront, I was no longer on the board, so I saw it more as a citizen at that time. But Sidewalk Labs is, its parent is Alphabet. Alphabet is the parent of Google. And it responded to the RFP that was issued by Toronto Waterfront. And as you said, that it was to Quayside, but I believe that even though it was Quayside, I think Sidewalk Labs never hid the fact that they had greater ambitions of just Quayside, but they always knew that that they had no rights to anything more than Quayside, but they certainly had ambitions. And the documents that they submitted was for much more land than just Quayside.
Right. And I mean, I, for one, was a little surprised when they entered the picture because they hadn't had a record of work in urban development or whatever. So the proposal for the Toronto Quayside project was really their first foray into this type of initiative, as I understand it.
Yeah, as best I know, Jim, that's the case. But I think from my discussions with them, they looked at and considered different opportunities, but they saw the Toronto and the lands as very special to them. So it wasn't that they weren't doing a lot of preparatory work and thinking about what a smart city and their involvement. And they saw Toronto as the ideal place.
Well, and I imagine part of thinking it was ideal was the quantity of land and the value of that land, and the fact that the city owned most of it. As I understand it, some was still privately owned, but most of it is owned by the city.
Yeah, but it was. I would say that that was one aspect, but I think it was Toronto itself and the talent in the city, how fast the city was becoming a central location for the digital world. There was a lot of reasons that Toronto was attractive, far more than I think than the land. The land was important, but the city itself, I think, was the.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay. Now, one criticism that's been made about the Quayside project was that it began with a technology company and then that helped frame what could and should be done, rather than starting with the public and what the public may have wanted, and then asking a technology company, how do we achieve that? Do you think that's a fair criticism, or what are your reflections on that issue?
Well, I would, no, how can I put it? It reminds me of being a president that someone says, all you have to do is consult. And I would say, you know, that you can, it's endless consulting. And people will tell you, no matter how much you consult, if you haven't got it the way I want it, then you haven't done enough consulting. So I think the framework of what the work that Toronto Waterfront was trying to achieve was already set. This is what I'm commenting on. They had essentially what you could call a terms of reference that established them back in 2001.
Right.
So I think, and they did a lot of consulting with the community, but it's very hard, you know, if I'm asking people advice on what is today and what everyone knows, that's one thing. But if you ask me to be innovative and think of ideas that no one has thought about before, and to be inventive, and then you say, but consult first. They're almost at the opposite ends. You know, people will be able to inform you on what they know and their dreams. But if you're coming into it with the idea that you are supposed to be able to provide new dreams for people to consider, it's very, very hard to go about consulting under that. But that doesn't mean that doesn't mean listening and to be able to put forward your ideas and to reflect upon people's attitudes for them. For sure, but I'm not so sure that you can have real innovation through a group think.
Okay. Another question that's arisen, certainly in the aftermath of the Sidewalk Labs project, was whether it was advisable, or whether it is advisable for a project of this sort to partner with just one company in terms of a smart cities project. Because a smart cities project involves so many different aspects, from land development, construction, technology management, amongst others. So Waterfront Toronto decided to seek one partner to do all this with. What are your thoughts? I mean, now Toronto's going to have to rethink that, now that Sidewalk Labs is left. Is this the kind of thing where you should have just one partner, or is it possible to consider having multiple partners with expertise in different aspects of what would be involved in a smart cities project?
Yeah, that's I would say that is one of the key questions going forward, and I would associate that with what is the element of risk that you're willing to take. But I think it's also goes to, what are you trying to achieve? If you are looking at the lands and you are asking the question about innovation and big dreams on big pieces of land, it's very hard to have multiple people trying to get the different pieces of the jigsaw puzzle to fit. It is really one picture that is trying to drive it. But if it's innovation that is using new technologies, existing technologies in a smart and better way, but don't have an overall vision, then I think it's much easier to be able to have multiple partners. Imagine that you're trying to do a jigsaw puzzle, and you're asking people to bring different pieces of their jigsaw puzzle to the table, and now let's assemble it together. It's, what are you trying to achieve? And so I think the clarity of what the objective is and what is the risk tolerance is probably the single most important piece. And it doesn't mean that what that necessarily means is a Sidewalk Lab strategy or not, but the clarity is hugely important on this. And recognize if you brought 20 people or 50 different companies, it will be a different project than bringing a single company with a single overarching vision.
Okay. Well, I just want to follow up a little bit on your comment about innovation and risk. You know, using your experience with Sidewalk Labs or what you know about what happened with Quayside, Can you comment on the relationship between the ambition for innovation on the one hand, while at the same time, the city's capacity or appetite for risk?
Yeah. So if you went, as you mentioned in your introduction, I did a piece of work for Toronto Waterfront, which looked at where it was Toronto Waterfront prepared and have the work necessary to enter into further negotiations with Sidewalk Labs. And in that letter, I sort of went a little further than the mandate to comment on risk. And really the comment was that if your objective is that the city cannot take that level of risk, that the city's responsibility is core services, and you could go on in that, then why are we here in the first place? Mm-hmm. As by the definition of what Sidewalk Labs was proposing and their understanding of winning the RFP, it had elements of risk, because anything that is new and untried has elements of risk. So it is so important to understand the risk tolerance that you have and what mitigation strategies and who leads the definition of risk. So if I could give you one example that just struck me when I was doing my work. So if I said to you, Jim, you're in Toronto, what drives you nuts about living in Toronto? You might say a lot of things, but I would add to it how often the streets are dug up and how often you can't get down this street because a water main burst, etc., and the whole street is dug up. So Waterfront Toronto, Sidewalk Labs had an idea of pavers. And conceptually it is, can you make the streets more like Lego blocks and repair them in that way? Conceptually, nice idea. Pull out a piece that is broken, plug in another piece. Well, this is conceptually a nice thing, but if you ask the city managers about this, they'd say, oh my God, do they know the weather in Toronto and the differences in temperature and the upheavals of this? And we have no one who knows how to do this stuff. And we don't even today have the money to be able to handle what we're going to do. Now you're going to saddle with this. I don't want it. Okay. A very, very rational response. But if that's where the responses are going to go from, which is an operational level, you will never take risk, because the operator isn't in the business of risk taking. The operator is in the business of providing the services for the people of Toronto. And so you have to make sure that the real appetite, not I call it the article in the newspaper that we're in the most innovative city, but your real appetite for risk has to be very, very clearly set. I remember, if I could give you another just short story, I remember speaking to a counselor, and I said to the counselor something about that the work I was doing, and this was a great idea, but it was risky. And the counselor immediately said, well, we don't take risks. The city of Toronto can't take risks. And I thought to myself, well, what are we doing, right? Because and I can't tell you how important it is to not talk about risk, but to be very, very deeply understand what it means. And the adoption of that level of risk is a leadership responsibility, because the leader of it has got to be able to ensure that the manager has the resources and the confidence to be able to go in that direction. And it doesn't mean taking big risk is a good thing. It might be the opposite, but the clarity of it is important. And when I was doing the work on at the very end with Sidewalk Labs, I felt there was really a disconnect between the appetite for risk and what Sidewalk Labs was proposing. And I don't blame Sidewalk Labs, and I don't blame the city. I think it really crept up on people because you say smart city, and they, oh yeah, we want to be a smart city. But really to understand what that means and the risk tolerance that you have, and not to figure out the risk formula after you sign the RFP. To have that clarity before you select who you want to be your partner. And this has to be absolutely clear.
Isn't the issue of risk a special issue for cities in Ontario, at least, because they're creatures of the provincial government? They don't have the ability to raise much money except through property taxes. Is there a way in which, if there really is a desire to do new things that are potentially risky, to ensure buy-in from the other levels of government that do have a better capacity to cope with unexpected expenses or unexpected developments, much more than a city? Was Waterfront Toronto meant to harmonize that in some way? But at the end of the day, it's the city that's really taking the risk in an environment where their hands are largely tied. I mean, as we saw when the new premier decided in the midst of an election to say, well, city, you're not going to have 47 councillors, you're going to have 25. And the city went to court and was told, sorry, folks, the province has those powers. You have very limited scope for action. Doesn't that promote a sort of risk aversion that is understandable? And how do we begin to cope with that if we want to engage in new and potentially risky but challenging initiatives?
Well, the Waterfront Board has representatives from 3 levels of government. So in some sense, you could say when a Waterfront Board signs on to an RFP, there is knowledge of all 3 levels of government. But I do take your point, because the consequences of my example of roads falls directly on the city. Right. So the point I'm trying to make is there has to be that understanding that if we're going down this road, that there is the appetite and assurances given by other levels of government to stand behind the city, because they think this idea of smart city at that level of risk is important. Now, really, really hard to identify all these things going forward. And you could say, boy, it's a lot easier with a looking in the rear view mirror. But at the same time, I think there really has to be almost like a philosophical statement of what level of innovation and what level of risk each of the parties are willing to take. And if the city, for example, says it's really important for us to be seen this way, but the province says, well, go for it, but don't count on me, or the federal government says the same, then that's another level of risk that the city would have to be able to deal with. It's just the clarity that I said is important, not the decision, but the clarity. Right. Of the decision.
I mean, Toronto or any other city in a smart cities project will want to see some or all aspects of a project, including things like affordable housing, an inclusive community, a hub for creative use of technology to serve public ends. Is a list like that, and that's just some of the things on the list, consistent with the effort being led by a for-profit private sector company?
Yeah, so what happens in this is the more you pile on to the more difficult it is for any private sector company to get a profit out of this. Right. And that's what, and unless it's a not-for-profit, or then okay, but this is a for-profit company. It has profit motives on it. So it's really, the risk is important, but also the definition of the requirements, and I would almost say at a micro level. And by that, I mean, how many affordable homes, what is the square foot of affordable homes, how many 1-bedroom, how many 2-bedroom, all of that has to be understood for the private sector to be able to put in a bid that at the end generates profit for them. But the objectives that Toronto Waterfront have that would include affordable homes, sustainable development, inclusive community, and on and on and on, are absolutely legitimate. Absolutely. There's no doubt about it. Put them all down and put what are the requirements. And if a private sector company says we can meet all of those, then you have to be sure that that private sector company has the heft to be able to do it, and they should be held accountable for making good on all of those. As well, if the city or the province adds things after the RFP is sent up or changes them, they have to be accountable for the financial consequences of that.
Right.
But it's, you know, over and over again, what I'll go back to is, even though it's going to be very, very difficult to itemize everything, it's way better to do this at the front end than to have the debate at the back end.
Now, another question that comes up is about the respective roles of governments in a project of this sort. You know, we have federal, provincial, and municipal. So, for example, for any conventional construction, the province has a building code that must be met, and the municipalities have an infrastructure for permits and for inspection. In the case of a digital cities project, as far as I know, there's no governance framework. Surely that's creates a problem.
Well, I think there was that maybe, and for many people, that might have been the biggest problem. If you're in Europe, you have GDPR, which is defines the general data protection regulations that everyone has to abide by. And it describes the use of data, the use of personal information. When Sidewalk Labs came, everyone, I would say everyone, most people had concerns about those issues that are in GDPR. And we wanted Sidewalk Labs we wanted the government to define it, but in the absence of that, we wanted Sidewalk Labs to give assurances. That's a very strange thing. The Sidewalk Labs, being the creature of alphabet, has very different objectives with regard to data.
Yes,
right?
indeed.
And now we're asking them to act like as a place, like as if they have a government responsibility. They should, if we're doing smart city, we should have our own GDPR that is very, very clear on the requirements of private sector companies. GDPR isn't a negotiation in Europe between government and a private sector company. It's the law.
Right.
So that created, I think, a lot of problems. And but your other example is really interesting as well, and it's one of physical. It's with regard to building code. So you want to do tall timber. You want to be able to build wooden structures taller than our building code. Well, this is a real interesting challenge, because it's not only innovation, it's a level of risk, it's a level of multiple governments. So it's not easy, but it's both a digital and a physical issues that touch us.
And I don't really see on the horizon how the digital issues are going to get resolved. I mean, Waterfront Toronto has somebody working with its digital strategy advisory panel to develop guidelines for digital initiatives. The city has a project, but really I would assume we need some guidance and direction from the federal government on this.
And the federal government has been working on it. But I think ultimately, if I was to give advice, it would be we need those desperately before starting again.
Yeah, I agree. One of the questions, there's been a lot of speculation about it, but I thought you might have some insight. Why do you think Sidewalk Labs walked away from the project?
Well, everyone read their letter, right? I mean,
Right.
so that
You might share what they, for the audience, if they haven't seen it, what they.
well, by and large, the letter said that given the issues of where we are today, given the price of land, given all sorts of economic circumstances, it just didn't seem a viable economic strategy anymore for Sidewalk Labs. That was,
Mhm.
by and large, their position, and I think that that calculus was probably right on it, and so, but they may very well have also concluded that the probability of them having any more land than Quayside, even if successful in the negotiation, was becoming less likely, and therefore the size of their dream and their overall ambition was going to be confined to a small parcel of land. And that also probably confined the economic opportunities that they saw as well. So I think it was a combination of many factors coming together, including COVID.
Yes, and I'm sure that created a lot of uncertainty about the real estate market, about the city and the government's capacity to fund this. We're going to turn to the audience in just a few minutes. So if anyone in the audience would like to ask a question of Sheldon, as I mentioned at the beginning, go down to the bottom, move your cursor down to the bottom of the screen. You'll see a button that says Q&A, and just write your question there. Sheldon, what lessons do you feel can be learned from what happened with the Toronto Sidewalk Labs experience for the development of the Toronto Portlands, in particular, and for smart cities projects in other communities? I mean, we've been talking a lot about Toronto. There are, in a variety of cities across Canada, things called smart cities. First of all, is your sense that they're like what Toronto was doing, or were they different, or were some of them rather different things, even though they had the label smart cities?
Yeah, I think one of the lessons is that hindsight is great, and so, but hindsight also gives you a lot of knowledge and learning for the next time around. But I would say that, as I mentioned, that be as much as you can be clear on the scope and risk that you're willing to. And all governments have an appreciation for the mitigation costs and the challenges of being able to meet that type of dream, but it has to be a leadership decision on the level of risk taken. Jim, we didn't talk about one of the other controversial issues on it, which was the Sidewalk Labs comes in and takes our economic wealth, right? That became a big issue, and I think it's fair to say in a conversation like that, one has to raise that issue that came up often. And in it, I think if you go back in history, when Eric Schmidt came and was with our Prime Minister, and
you might point out who Eric Schmidt was.
But Eric Schmidt is the CEO of Alphabet, which is the parent of Sidewalk, and he commented to thank Canada for all the work it did on AI, and that it now drives the Alphabet's fortunes. There was a lot of people that read that as, why is it that our intellectual property, our research is going across the border to make someone else rich? Why can't it make us wealthy in our country? Why can't it add wealth in our country? From there, there was a lot of very, very fine people that worried that when you have alphabet that is very, in my mind, you can't pretend that Sidewalk isn't going to be guided by alphabet.
Right.
I don't think a child can be separate from its parent that way. So there was really a real legitimate concern that what are we going to do? All of this is going to be this grand experiment, and that we'll learn a lot of things. We'll get all the talent of Canada, and what are we going to do? Ship it again to the States? And people like Jim Vasili was arguing that our economic prosperity is about intellectual property, and we got to be really, really, really concerned about this.
Mm-hmm.
But look at anything with the RFP, of which I can't say I looked every word. I'll bet you very little was on the economic wealth of the country. Too often it's defined as jobs.
Mm-hmm.
Jobs is not owning your intellectual property. And so there was all of this that was going on, and at the same time, what I would say to this is that when I looked at the work that Toronto Waterfront did and what the requirements that they were putting on now Sidewalk Labs, it was a lot to be able to ensure, if whatever development there was there, that Canadians would have all the rights to be able to be entrepreneurial and to be able to gain resources and to be able to gain wealth, et cetera, et cetera. So they were doing all that. Mm-hmm. But it was a very legitimate concern of Canadians on all of this stuff, what you could call the intangible world of the economy, and bringing in probably the most aggressive player right there.
I think so.
And when the president begins by acknowledging that's what they did.
Right.
But what I don't, where I come out on the other side is that I believe under the way it was being framed by Toronto Waterfront towards the end, that if they could have delivered on that negotiation, we had crossed over that bridge. But other good people would say, oh, Sheldon, you're really naive. This is never going to happen. Shake your head. And what I really want to say to that, these are really, really intellectually important, economically important issues. And what I would just say to everyone is that no matter if you were on one side or you're on the other side, the debate was healthy. And if we didn't have that debate in the country and we didn't get informed by it and educated by it, then we've lost this grand opportunity to do it better the next time. Well, but I don't take sides on this. I think there wasn't any good or any bad people. There was passionate people, and passionate people on the other side that said this is a chance for Toronto to be able to be the star of the world in so many ways. And by being that star, it would bring so much to the city. And they saw it through that lens. Other people saw it through another lens. But the debate, by and large, was healthy.
Well, and hopefully it'll be instructive, because there's certainly a desire, pending what I'm going to ask you next, to go ahead with something. And there's similar interests in cities around Canada and around the world. So hopefully we don't simply repeat our history. I guess my last question before turning to the audience has to do with the time we're in. I mean, normally you and I would be having this discussion in a room at Ryerson with an audience and where it's being filmed, but we're in the midst of a pandemic, which it's increasingly clear is going to have to cause us to rethink a lot of things we took for granted about cities and about the implications for smart cities projects, issues of density, use of public transportation, a whole variety of issues. Do you have any thoughts as to how we might factor that in? Or is it just too soon to have a sense of where that's going?
Yeah, I think that those questions are far bigger than than a smart city. They are every city's question.
Right.
And everything from is 70-story skyscrapers our future? How are you going to bring people downtown in crowded subways? There's 1,000 questions, and I don't think a smart city that is one part of it is going to solve those things. I think a smart city that people will envision today might be very, very different than one they saw 6 months ago. But I think they are macro big issues for every city, and we're going to be confronting them in the next few months.
We certainly are. I wasn't suggesting that smart cities would solve those problems, but as we're thinking of design questions and a variety of priorities for whatever parcel of land on which we would build a smart cities project, we'd want to take those things into consideration so we don't design things just as we would have 6 months ago before.
One way of thinking of the answer to that of smart city is, rather than thinking of it as we have as a community that has all the aspects of affordable homes, etc. What happens if we thought of it as a true experiment?
Mm-hmm.
And with true research and all of the implications of that, and that we did it not to build only the smart city, but to build for us an understanding of different aspects of building and understanding a city that can flow to the whole city.
Mm-hmm.
Looked at it as more of a laboratory approach than a final community approach, because in some ways that was the conflict that was going on all along.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when risk is well understood, because it is defined for the need to be able to minimize risk on a larger footprint called the whole city, and to be able to have the risk and the experimentation done on one part of the city.
Mm-hmm.
That would be a different aspect of a smart city, but that's not what we were building. We were doing an experiment that had to have a certain positive known conclusion. So imagine you're a researcher that is going to do your research, and someone is telling you, terrific, make sure the conclusion is perfect, right? Well, I don't know if the two go together.
Well, let's turn to the audience. Ange, could you share with us the first question that's come in?
Yeah, the first question is from David, and David asks if you can be more specific about the different kinds of risks that were there with Sidewalk Labs.
Yeah, so I would say there were the different types of risks were one, what you could call, that I mentioned on the economic agenda of, or the economic value of Sidewalk Labs vis-a-vis Canadian companies being able to become prosperous there. So the economic risk. I would say the other risk was what I would call a building or a structural risk, and you could call it tall timber, you could call it modular roads, a lot of new structures that were being put in. But I would say almost every aspect had some element of risk in it, some larger than others, but it wasn't confined. It was both a digital risk that people were worried about, but it was also a physical risk that people were worried about.
Okay. Action.
Yeah, the next question is from Renee, and Renee asks, what was the role of the public, specifically Bianca Wiley, in divorcing Sidewalk and Waterfront?
Of public consultation, is that the question?
What was the role of the public's, and like specifically Bianca Wiley, the work that she was doing in divorcing Sidewalk and Waterfront?
So I don't know that work, so I don't want to comment, but the role of the public, there was, I would say there was so many hearings on it with the public, but the public was by and large commenting on those things that were being presented to it during this project. But I really can't comment on other people's work.
Okay, Ange, do we have another question?
We have a couple more. So the next one is from a Ryerson student, Denise. Amid the COVID situation, our economy looks more worrisome than ever. Being that, what activities do cities such as Toronto currently do that they should shed? And I would
Could you
assume.
could you repeat that again?
Yeah,
You
please.
broke up a little bit in the midst of it.
Sorry about that. Amid the COVID situation of COVID-19, our economy looks more worrisome than ever. Being that, what activities do cities such as Toronto currently do that they should shed?
Good. Shelf?
Should shed.
Shed.
Stop.
Shed. Oh my goodness.
I'm glad you're
that
getting
goes-
ask easy questions, Sheldon.
Yeah, that one goes beyond my level of pay for this performance, but I'm going to answer it in a different way if I could. I'll take the opportunity. One of the attributes that people wanted to see in Toronto waterfront is to know there is a waterfront there, that there is parks, that is accessible, and that it is a place where people can, in Toronto, can enjoy. If there is anything that we have seen in COVID and the post of it is how important it is that public spaces be enjoyed. And to be able to increase the number of public spaces and to put more attention in our city on public places, I think is hugely important. And I think the gardener is an obstruction to public places, if I could be blunt. But that wasn't on the agenda as well. But I would say what I wouldn't do is minimize parks and recreation places and places where people get out of their home and enjoy the environment.
Okay, Ange, do we have another question?
Yeah, another one is somebody asked, how has COVID-19 affected smart cities projects, and how long do you think that the impact will be felt?
Well, the way I would put this one is that I could imagine that those that are thinking about what next in Quayside or the other lands will have a different RFP today than they would have had 6 months ago. And I think that RFP is going to be influenced by the experience, not only the experiences of this past few months, but by the opportunities of rethinking a city that could give people the opportunities, if God forbid this ever happens again, to be able to have a better lifestyle outcome of it. But I think there's going to be a total rethinking of smart city because of COVID. But I would say that's going to be true of office planning, tower planning, food courts. I think it's not confined only to smart city.
All right, do you have one more question, Ange?
Yes, I have one more. This is from Rachel. Rachel asks, could you speak to the role of Waterfront Toronto on advancing the affordable housing project and its rent geared to income approach? How was the collaboration with Sidewalk Labs determined?
How was the what? Sorry?
The collaboration with Sidewalk Labs determined.
Yeah, so one thing I want to assure everyone is that on the issue of affordable homes, the number, the square footage, this was absolutely a given. There was no bending of Waterfront Toronto with regard to be able to meet the mandate of affordable homes and for the community. So they took that mandate and they took it very, very seriously. And if there was ever going to be a deal, if the negotiations continued with Sidewalk Labs, that was one of the ones that would not be compromised on. I could assure you 100% that of the things that you really saw coming out was affordable homes and an inclusive community. I could tell you people were well served by Toronto Waterfront on those those aspects.
Sheldon, there was one other issue that was in play over the whole discussion of the Waterfront Toronto issue, which comes up with regard to every smart cities project, and that's control of the data that are created by these initiatives. And there seemed to be a lot of struggle over who would have access to it, how it would protect people's privacy, how we deal with surveillance. You know, in looking back on the project, do you have some sense of how we might address that issue more productively going forward?
Yeah, Jim, I do believe that that at the most fundamental level, this is, as you said, the federal government's responsibility to define it, and that whether it's Sidewalk Labs or XYZ, they have to be able to confine themselves and to be able to handle the data according to the laws of the country. I think if you then said to them, we want you to go beyond the laws of the country, I would probably say then go to the legislators and tell them to improve the laws of the country. But I think it's fundamentally that you're abiding by the laws of the country. You know, it'd be, if I could give you a crazy example, you're building a car, and I say, well, the car has got to be able to fit on the roads. It's got to have safety standards. It's got to have airbags. It's got to have seat belts. It's got to have a whole lot of things. Otherwise, don't build that car. We're not going to put it on the road. Well, all of those structures are regulations or laws that are set by government that tell the manufacturer what they have to achieve. And in some cases, it's the amount of gas efficiency on it. But you don't build an automobile and then say to the manufacturer, so we want it to be environmentally sound. Could you please tell us how many kilometers per liter is being used? They're defined by government, and then the company has to be able to come in and abide by laws and regulations. That's how I see data.
But as you know, we struggle with this issue all the time now, whether it be offensive speech on Twitter or Facebook, and the inclination is to say, well, we want you, the private company, to solve this for us. We want you to decide what's hateful and take it off your platform. And I find it really curious that we had a long history of concerns about state regulation of expression, for example.
Oh, yeah.
And are very guarded about what we allow governments to do. But there seems to be a willingness just to say, well, but Facebook, you can be the censor. You can decide what the standards are. You can set up a panel on community standards and have an algorithm that none of us understands. It's essentially a black box that will govern what we see and what we don't see. And that's your problem to solve. I had a sense that there was almost a similar thing going on with Sidewalk Labs, that there were all sorts of concerns about data governance and all that. But there was nobody stepping forward at the federal, provincial, or municipal level to say, you know, to have the public actually decide that and how these things are going to be dealt with.
Well, you're onto something that is really, really, really interesting, which I've now given me. What I hear you saying is, yeah, we'll have all those rules, we'll have them, but the most important rules, that is on what level of censorship, what defines hate, we only have the interpretation of those rules we leave to the Google or the Facebook or whoever it is, and yet we get so concerned about the lanes that they're going in, but not as concerned about the most fundamental use of those lanes. I think that's a big societal problem. It's not a smart city problem. It's a big societal. But to think that a committee could solve this one, wow.
Yep.
You know, that's a challenge. So at best, I think legislators can only do their best at doing their version of GDPR, and we will have, as a country, continued debates on these things. And all I could say is, as long as the debate is going and people feel comfortable about having a free expression to be able to, that is done honestly and civilly, then we'll be okay. It's, you know, you and I've talked about this often. It's when you suppress debate that the real problems ultimately will surface.
Well, and if any of our listeners want to see what you're referring to in terms of the GDPR, just Google GDPR, because there's been a lot of work in Europe, and we're well behind the curve on that one.
Right.
And are there some additional questions?
There are, yeah. There's a question from Marriott. Marriott asks, why do you think a corporation like Alphabet with expertise in data wants to be involved in a smart city project?
Well, I would say that one of them is because the smart city and experimentation with a variety of technologies, including sensors, gives them data that ultimately has value, right? I mean, it's a private sector company that lives off data. So they want to be able to learn a lot about how a city in the future would work. They were determined to do a great job, but ultimately, I think that this is it has economic value to them, and I think we just had to make sure that the economic value was in Canada, and not all of it as in the United States.
Well, I think we may have time for one more question. Do you have a last question, Ange?
I do, yeah. Many people were concerned that Sidewalk was far from sufficiently transparent about many aspects of its proposals, its business models, what data it was going to collect or use, the role of Alphabet, etc. What advice would you give to Waterfront Toronto to ensure future proponents are more transparent, especially since you indicated that clarity about risk is vital to establish at the beginning?
Yeah, so I might challenge the hypothesis a tiny bit. I think what I saw when I reviewed the material from from Sidewalks was a tremendous amount of transparency. I didn't see questions being answered vaguely. Where I think the lack of transparency was rather a lack of clarity that was defining the project to begin with. So people were probably more often surprised at aspects of it, but I don't believe that there was cloak and dagger going on at all. Now, you could say that I'm naive, but I can tell you that I saw the questions Waterfront Toronto asked Sidewalk Labs, and I saw very, very solid answers. Didn't mean we would all like the answers, but I didn't see the level of secrecy that is inferred by that question.
Well, Sheldon, I think we're going to wrap up. Is there anything we haven't covered, or is there something you would like to say in the way of a concluding comment?
Yeah, I would say only as a concluding comment the following. Very, very few cities would be having a discussion like we had today with Alphabet here and that. And I think it is the success of the city that has brought us to the point that we could have what we might be perceived even as a failure. Some people would see it as a success. The other thing I just want to say to everyone is that, like a university, like this project, having vigorous debate and having strong opinions and emotional opinions is another part of building a great city. So I think I just took a bit of sadness that we personalize some things too often, when it was really just passionate people on both sides of the agenda trying to make Toronto and Canada as best it could possibly be, but we don't necessarily see eye to eye. But the fact that we can argue and debate it, I think is essential for everything we do as a society.
Well, on behalf of the center and our audience, Sheldon, I want to thank you so much for spending this time with us and sharing your views on this. It's not just an academic or abstract discussion, because it's pretty clear we're going to be back, whether it's in the next few months or a little bit longer due to the pandemic, dealing with all these issues. And certainly your thoughts tonight and this discussion that hopefully will carry on will help us be better positioned to move forward in a productive way for the city and for the people of the city.
And Jim, thank you. And thank you also for all the good work you do.
That's my pleasure. So I'd like to just remind everybody that the last of our June forum will be next Tuesday afternoon at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, where we're going to be looking at those platforms we were just discussing, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and other platforms, and what are the challenges they're creating for society, and what things could be done to fix them. We have quite a distinguished panel. It's being co-sponsored by Penn Canada. I'd encourage you to join. You can learn more about it on the CFE website, cfe.ryerson.ca, under events. Again, thank you for coming. Sheldon, thank you, and thank the audience. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.